Social Democrats, Deputy Holly Cairns.
Thank you, Lascian Corla. And first of all, Minister Hackett, I'd like to formally congratulate you on your appointment. I think we need transformative change in the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. I know it will be challenging, but it's essential, and I'm really looking forward to working with you, both of you, to do that. And I really hope this piece of legislation is a bad start to a brilliant term. As you explained yesterday, there is a crisis in the forestry sector. The licensing and appeals system has been overwhelmed by delays, which wasn't addressed until in many ways it was too late. This has been detrimental to our afforestation strategies, to the industry, so many jobs, and now to an important appeals process too. We all agree that an efficient appeals system is needed. However, this bill is not that. The government's argument is that the appeals process needs to change, but many of us think the department should simply deal with the appeals that they get. Imagine if we dealt with other situations in the same way you're dealing with this one. Imagine if there was a really long waiting list for driving tests, and instead of carrying out more tests, we went away and made it really hard and expensive to apply. It's quite difficult to imagine, and that is why so many people are aghast at the approach that's been taken here. This legislation fails to address the problem that we have. This is not a new crisis. Those in the sector have pointed out repeatedly. In the 4 years of the Forestry Appeals Committee, they have only heard 33% of the appeals. The current average appeals rate is 20 per month, so now predictably there is a backlog of 2 years, and we knew this would happen. So why wait until breaking point to address it? And I know you're new to this brief and aren't responsible for the inaction of previous governments, but it is worth acknowledging that this is ridiculous. The sector is understandably supporting the bill. However, it is the only solution an industry on the brink of collapse has been offered. Of course, they're in favour of some kind of action. Similar to the National Broadband Plan or the Children's Hospital, we're being presented with an unsuitable proposal at a time when people are so desperate that we're forced to accept it. While the government buys into its own rhetoric that it is saving the industry, it doesn't acknowledge its own inaction and underinvestment is what put the sector in this position and at risk in the first place. In future, a new approach is essential. Time and time again, when it comes to the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, we see the same ridiculous turn of events unfold. Firstly, shortcomings from the department and their policies. Secondly, this somehow not being the focus of the debate. And finally, instead, an industry being pitted against environmentalists, and we have that pointless debate. The result is that the industries and individuals who will be the most affected by climate change are the most worried about climate action. This is happening in every sector under the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. The situation we're in today is a classic example of that. From meeting with the industry over recent months, I know that they don't take issue with an accessible appeals process. Their issue lies with the snail's pace at which the department was getting through them. Nobody that I spoke to in the forestry sector has any intention whatsoever of damaging the environment, the opposite. We know that the forestry sector has to play a key role in addressing the climate crisis we're facing. The industry knows that too, and it's a sad reality that isn't what we're discussing here today. That policies aren't anywhere near good enough to address this, that these inadequate policies shape everything that happens in the sector, and that the department hasn't been able to adequately process appeals is not the fault of the industry, nor is it the fault of the people who have genuine concerns about planting and felling licences. Minister, we can all agree that we need more resources and expertise in the licensing and appeals system to clear the backlog. There are solutions here that won't negatively affect a democratic appeals process, and I seriously urge you to consider them. One of my amendments seeks to have a statutory obligation for appeals to be heard in a timely manner. This simple change, not redrawing the whole system, will resolve the sector's key concerns. The legislation doesn't address other major issues for the sector, like climate change and Brexit. Over 80% of our forestry exports go to the UK. We need to make sure we learn from mistakes like this one. We can't wait until the industry is in the midst of another crisis before doing something about it. If we learn anything from the COVID crisis, it should be to prepare for future ones, particularly ones we know are on the way. This department should be leading the way with solutions for the climate crisis, not creating them. Forestry needs to be recognised as one of the most important solutions here, and it can't continue to be treated like a poor relation of other agricultural industries by the department. I would love to work with you both to achieve this. We need ambitious policy to help this sector not only survive Brexit but also create a sustainable industry. Minister, given your specific brief, we should be using the little time we have on forestry to discuss a national forestry programme and its role in increasing biodiversity. Stakeholders have been calling for this for years. The programme for government commits to creating one. We need to concentrate on this instead of eroding regulations. The bill is being pushed through at a very irresponsible rate. The heads of bill and public consultation process were published on the Friday afternoon of the bank holiday weekend, a tactic formerly used by the Department of Housing when releasing ever-increasing homelessness figures, and the public consultation ran across August, a month we know people are less likely to engage in. And now it is being rushed through the houses of the Oireachtas. On Thursday, we were asked for amendments to the bill before the Shannon had even made theirs. At first, I thought as a new TD I didn't quite understand the process, but I quickly learned that this is extremely unusual and is poor practice. The stages of the bill are basically being rushed through as a box-ticking exercise. Our primary role here is to make legislation. We need to ensure that we scrutinise laws. Along with others, I'm deeply concerned that due to the speed of the bill, nuanced and subtle aspects have been overlooked, which will potentially leave the state open to criticism and liability under national and international environmental commitments. While there are welcome additions in this bill, there are also many items which are not fully developed or are concerning for public involvement. The ability of the Forestry Appeals Committee to sit in all divisions will allow more appeals to be heard, and I do welcome that. But we have to ensure that this doesn't result in a diluting of expertise. There is no guidance in the legislation to ensure that the divisions will have sufficient expertise that guarantees informed decision-making. I have submitted amendments to secure the independence of the Appeals Committee. It's essential that the committees are populated with the right people and that they are separate from the department. The Minister has likened this system to An Bord Pleanála, in which case the Forestry Appeals Committee should similarly consist of experts from relative representative bodies. We need commitments that the committee and its divisions will have sufficient knowledge of the industry, good forestry practice, biodiversity, water quality, climate change and environmental legislation. We also need commitments that the Minister won't appoint officers from the department or government to the committee. This legislation provides the Minister with the power to make regulations for the forestry appeals process. On the face of it, this is good as it allows changes to be made to address future obstacles. However, there is no clear Oireachtas oversight of this. It is a concentration of power in the department without the necessary checks and balances. This bill also introduces reasonable fees for appeals. I emphasise reasonable because the Minister stated that the fees would likely be €20 for a submission and about €200 for an appeal. Similar to Senator Lynn Ruane and Senator Alice Mary Higgins, I have submitted an amendment to change this to fees which are fair and equitable. I urge the Minister to seriously reconsider her thinking on this issue of fees, because, Minister, I think you'll agree that the ability to participate in licensing and an appeals system should not be an economic privilege. Today highlights the government's perspective on public participation in decision-making. At the heart of a vibrant democracy, there is citizens' engagement. The state needs to encourage involvement from communities, NGOs and everyone. This is a principle that needs to underpin how government functions. However, in Ireland, this is often not the case. Communities can feel they're struggling against the state. The Protective Native Kelp campaign in Bantry and the Save Our Skibbereen campaign against a plastics factory are two recent examples from my own constituency in Cork South West. It shouldn't be left up to communities like them to raise massive amounts of money to right these wrong decisions in court. Regrettably, in attempting to resolve the forestry appeals backlog, the government is rolling back on one of our more progressive participatory systems, and this is undoubtedly a mistake. Attempts to define who can be involved, financial barriers and uses of complicated mechanisms such as the access to information on the environmental regulations erode the ability of people to contribute decisions that affect their areas. It's at odds with good public participation practice. Furthermore, I remain unconvinced that it meets our commitments under the Public Participation Directive and the Århus Convention. Minister, how robustly has this legislation been scrutinised in this time? Can you guarantee that this law will not be found in breach of the right to participate in environmental decision-making and to challenge public decisions? Forestry can make a significant contribution to a sustainable economy that supports rural communities. The current forestry system is failing communities, the industry and workers. The erosion of regulation and introducing fees will do nothing to address those underlying issues. We need a new forestry programme, and we need it yesterday. The sector is in desperate need of reform, and stakeholders are ready for the challenge of developing an ambitious scheme that will define a new era in Irish forestry. We should be focusing on forestry policy that takes urgent climate action and supports the industry. To do that, we know importing timber isn't the solution here. We know using concrete instead of timber isn't the solution. We know placing barriers into an appeals process isn't the solution. Ireland is the most deforested country in Europe. While reforestation is ongoing, most of it is with non-native plantations used for commercial forestry. While it's certainly better than importing timber, these forests are poor habitat for wildlife, and we need more broadly forestry, but government policy needs to incentivise both, and the latter urgently, for the industry to be able to do that. We need clear rewilding strategies, the conversion of portions of agricultural land to native forestry, and the establishment of wildlife corridors. We need forestry on every farm, with special incentives in place along watercourses, and special areas of conservation to generate connected wildlife corridors throughout the country. I am supportive of aspects of the bill, but I also have serious concerns about it. I've made a number of pragmatic amendments based on my engagement with the forestry sector in West Cork, farmers, environmental groups, constituents, and with colleagues in the Seanad. I have a balanced variety of perspectives in addressing the appeals backlog, the right of public participation, and the sustainability of the sector, issues of the independence of the appeals process, the involvement of experts, the participation of public, and of course the current crisis in the sector and the timely processing of appeals all need to be addressed. I ask both Minister Hackett and Minister McConalogue to seriously look at how they can accommodate amendments that I and like-minded TDs have made that you agreed to do in last week's briefing. Thank you.
Deputy Kearns. Now, Deputy Mark.